Hey there, I'm Swapnil, and welcome to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most tense periods in history, the Cold War. From the ashes of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union emerged, each with their own ideologies and nuclear arsenals. Imagine a global chess match, full of espionage, proxy wars, and the constant threat of mutually assured destruction. So buckle up as we break down the key events and rivalries that defined this era, especially the shadow war between the CIA and the KGB. Our story begins in 1945, not with a bang, but with a handshake. The Allied leaders met at Yalta to discuss the post-war world order. Stalin wanted a buffer zone of Soviet-friendly states in Eastern Europe. This disagreement planted the seeds of mistrust that would blossom into the Cold War. The Yalta Conference highlighted the growing ideological divide. The year is 1947. The Soviets are tightening their grip on Eastern Europe. Enter the Truman Doctrine. President Truman pledged support against communist expansion. This marked the shift to Cold War rivalry. The US was committed to containing communism. The Cold War had officially begun. Containing communism wasn't just about military might. It was also about winning hearts and minds. Enter the Marshall Plan in 1948, a massive economic aid package offered by the US to war-torn Europe. The idea was simple: help rebuild Europe, make it prosperous, and you make it less susceptible to communist influence. The Soviets saw it as a blatant attempt to buy influence and undermine their own sphere of control. The Marshall Plan helped to strengthen Western European economies and tie them closer to the US. This economic battleground became another front in the Cold War, with both sides vying for influence and control. Imagine a city once vibrant, now divided. Welcome to Berlin, 1948. The Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin. This was the Berlin blockade, a high-stakes gamble by Stalin. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, a logistical marvel and a symbol of Western resolve. After almost a year, the Soviets lifted the blockade. Berlin became a symbol of a world divided by ideology. As the Cold War intensified, a new kind of warfare emerged, fought in the shadows with whispers and secrets. In 1947, the United States established the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to gather intelligence and conduct covert operations abroad. The CIA quickly became embroiled in covert operations, supporting coups, arming rebel groups, and engaging in espionage. The agency played a pivotal role in shaping the global landscape, often operating outside the bounds of traditional diplomacy. However, its methods and interventions sparked controversy and debate, raising questions about accountability and the limits of covert action. In 1954, the Soviet Union formed the KGB, the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности. The KGB was more than just an intelligence agency. It was the shield and sword of the Soviet state. Tasked with internal security, border control, and foreign intelligence, the KGB wielded immense power. It infiltrated every level of Soviet society, suppressing dissent and ensuring loyalty. The rivalry between the CIA and the KGB became a defining feature of the Cold War. A shadow conflict played out in the shadows. Both agencies engaged in a dangerous dance of deception, seeking any advantage in the global struggle for dominance. The Cold War wasn't just about tanks and missiles. It was a war of whispers, a battle fought in the shadows with secrets and lies. Both the CIA and KGB poured resources into espionage, recruiting spies and cultivating assets globally. Double agents, code names, and dead drops became the tools of the trade as both sides sought to penetrate the other's intelligence apparatus. The stories of Cold War espionage are the stuff of legend, filled with daring escapes, double crosses, and tragic betrayals. In 1950, the Cold War turned hot on the Korean Peninsula. When Communist North Korea invaded US-backed South Korea, it triggered a conflict that would draw in both superpowers. The Korean War became a proxy war, with the US and its allies supporting the South, while the Soviet Union and China backed the North. It was a brutal conflict marked by intense fighting and massive casualties. The Korean War ended in a stalemate in 1953, with the peninsula still divided. It was a sobering reminder of the cost of Cold War rivalry and the ever-present danger of nuclear war. In 1956, the world watched in horror as a popular uprising against Soviet rule erupted in Hungary. The Hungarian people, yearning for freedom and democracy, dared to challenge the might of the Soviet Empire. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, brutally crushing the rebellion. The Hungarian Revolution exposed the limits of Western power and the brutal reality of Soviet control. The West, despite its rhetoric of freedom and democracy, was unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union over Hungary. The events of 1956 deepened the Cold War divide. In 1959, a revolution shook the Caribbean island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed Batista regime and established a communist government. For the US, this was a major blow, seen as a direct threat to American security. The US responded with a series of covert operations aimed at toppling Castro, including the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. These efforts only served to push Cuba further into the Soviet orbit. The Cuban Revolution brought the Cold War to America's doorstep and set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the world watched in disbelief as a concrete barrier rose in the heart of Berlin, physically dividing the city. The Berlin Wall, built by East Germany with Soviet backing, was designed to stem the tide of people fleeing communist rule. For those trapped in the East, the wall represented oppression. For those in the West, it was a constant reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall stood for almost 3 decades, a potent symbol of division. Its fall in 1989 marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. In October 1962, the world held its breath as the US and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, sparked by the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss. For 13 tense days, the world watched as President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes game of chicken. Each side refused to back down, raising the specter of nuclear annihilation. In the end, diplomacy prevailed and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The crisis left an indelible mark on the Cold War, highlighting the terrifying stakes of the conflict. In the jungles of Vietnam, the Cold War turned into a protracted and bloody conflict. The United States, seeking to contain the spread of communism, became increasingly embroiled in a war against communist North Vietnam and its allies in the South. The Vietnam War was a complex and controversial conflict, marked by intense fighting and heavy casualties. For the Vietnamese people, the war was a devastating struggle for independence and reunification. For the United States, it became a quagmire, a draining conflict that eroded public support and divided the nation. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, seeking to prop up a faltering communist government. The Afghan Mujahideen, supported by the United States and other Western powers, waged a fierce resistance against the Soviet occupation. The Afghan war became a draining stalemate for the Soviet Union, sapping its resources and demoralizing its troops. After a decade of fighting, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, defeated and demoralized. The war had a profound impact on the Soviet psyche, contributing to the growing disillusionment with communism. Ultimately, it led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. In 1989, the world watched in astonishment as the Berlin Wall crumbled before their eyes. Driven by peaceful protests and a wave of democratic revolutions sweeping across Eastern Europe, the wall's fall marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. The collapse of communism in Eastern Europe was swift and dramatic. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, bringing an end to the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the triumph of democracy over communism and the dawn of a new world order. The Cold War, though bloodless in direct military confrontation, had profound consequences for the world. So, There you have it, a whirlwind tour through some of the most defining moments of the Cold War. It was a period of immense tension, constant brinkmanship, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. And as always, stay curious.